So we have saved the best for last with a panel discussion that is going to pull together all of the thoughts that we've introduced today into actionable items that you as self-insured employers can take. So I am going to turn this over to Mark Trusheim, who will be our panel leader, and just remind you all that the Q&A feature is in that bottom right corner of the Zoom panel. Please post your questions so the panel can address them. So Mark, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jane, and thanks especially for setting such low expectations for this panel for us all to try to live up to now. So great to have everyone with me here today. Let me go through a couple introductions. Of course, we have Michelle Harico with us, who you've already seen as the Chief Clinical Officer of Equity Healthcare, and also Mabe Koja, who was and is the Chief Actuary at BCS Financial. But we're also being joined by two additional people today. First, Cindy Pigg, who's the Senior Vice President of Pharmacy and for U.S. Health Solutions within Aon, and also Luke Petrol, who works for AT&T, where he has the internal role of lead benefit strategy consultant working across the business units at AT&T. So it's a fantastic panel. We hope it's going to be lively, informative, and perhaps even mildly entertaining upon occasion through this. And it's going to be dependent as well on your questions to drive this. We have a number of questions here that I have set up, but these are always much more interesting when you ask us questions and put us on the spot or let us go into new areas for this. So I really hope you use that Q&A feature. So with that, I'm going to just dive right in with some questions here. Cindy, can you give perhaps a little more background on yourself, and then talk a bit about what is the impact of cell and gene therapies on self-insured employer planning for health benefits? Because I know that's a strong part of your background.
Hey, sure. Thanks, Mark. So a little bit about me. I have spent most of my career, I am a pharmacist was my clinical training, but found a passion for the business of pharmacy, and have spent many years in health plans and PBMs and drug wholesaler that led me to Aon to really focus on helping self-insured employers maximize your financial investment and your employees' clinical investment in their care. So what do you as self-insured employers need to focus on your planning? Well, one thing that is for sure, that as we emerge out of this pandemic, hopefully, that
we're emerging.
Yeah, get your vaccine. Okay, sorry. But as we emerge out of the pandemic, one thing that our employers have really learned to do is to deal with rapid change and adapt to situations, unlike any of us have ever had to deal with before. So with this, what we see our employers really focusing on is the productivity of their workforce, and also how do they really drive a resilient workforce. So there's a continuum of employers working in what is their health strategy, what is their wellness strategy, but really coming together under this resilient workforce umbrella. So as far as your planning for cell and gene therapies, first and foremost, this is an area that, as you've heard today and probably had some exposure to before today, it's very complex. And the stakes are very high financially and clinically. So you really have to be informed. Figure out that mechanism in your planning to understand. Followed by, you really need a strategy that is comprehensive. Hopefully you weren't tuning in today thinking there was one stop shopping and a solution that, oh, this solves all my problems. Because if you thought that before, I'm pretty sure you're convinced now that that's not what this is. But developing your strategy and some components to think about as you develop your strategy. Number one, the level of risk. We've talked a lot about that today. What is your organization's level of risk tolerance? So moving on from that of what you can afford is really the financing solutions, the cost of these medications. How do you want to approach that? And it's the total cost, not just the cost of the therapy, but it's the cost of the administration, as Michelle talked about, that also needs to be considered. After you move on from your risk and the cost and the financing solutions, benefit design. How do you want to structure your benefits to lead to that resilient workforce that really fits within your philosophy of health and wellness, and the employer contributions, your contributions, and that whole benefit design as part of your health and wellness strategy. Clinical management is a key part to look at in your holistic strategy of managing cell and gene therapies. What is the patient journey along that clinical management? How is your clinical management going to support the durability of the treatment? These things are not, you get the treatment and then you're cured. There's a lot of care that goes into that. And you don't want to waste your investment that you have spent, or your employees or their dependent investment that they've made financially and in their health. So you really need to think about that clinical management. Another component I'll throw out there is really the prescriber management and the provider components. You're looking at centers of excellence, but very vital and critical is your providers that administer these therapies are significant in how well that investment is maximized. Again, kind of falls into the clinical management, but really thinking about that prescriber. And then the final point that I'll throw it as your comprehensive strategy is really the point solutions. How do you fit all these pieces together so that it makes sense for you as the employer? How does it make sense for your employees, the caregivers, because a lot of these patients will have caregivers, and how do these all fit together in that comprehensive strategy? And finally, just the foundation of all of this is the criticality of data and analytics that give you actionable insights. It's not just, I tell my staff, do not give me a report. That is information. I need to know the so what of the action of that report. So in summary, Mark, all these things come together in the planning of a comprehensive strategy that really is holistic, it is agile, and that it is designed to meet the knowledge that is going to be pouring out as this industry matures.
Wow, I think we can stop the panel right now. We seem to have done it all with that, Cindy, but I would like to follow up on something you talked about, this resilient workforce, right? These cell and gene therapies are often targeted at conditions that are fairly debilitating for the family member or the employee themselves. How do you talk to your employers about seeing that addition to the resilience and the availability and presenteeism and productivity of an employee who now can devote more attention or be less distracted perhaps by the chronic condition or the debilitating condition either of themselves or of a family member?
So I think you just answered the question. It really is, and welcome Luke's insight into this. It really is, how can, as an employer, I help design those outcomes and support that employee and their family and their caregivers so that they are productive and they feel productive and their disease does not consume them, that it's a manageable part of their health and their journey, and that they are able to show up to work and be present.
And I've also noticed in the organizations I've worked in my career that one employee who has such a condition, their colleagues rally around them and can also be distracted. So helping that one employee can really help an entire work team has been my impression as well. And to your point, it'd be wonderful to find ways to measure that impact to really help employers see, the value and the benefits that they're receiving from all this. Great stuff, Cindy. So Luke, same thing for you. Not everyone on on the workshop has met you yet. So could you tell us a little bit about yourselves, and then sort of build on what Cindy's talked about again about this employer balancing this access and affordability challenge?
Yeah, great, Mark. So a little background on me. I started in consulting, did that for a few years and realized I like doing things. I like getting into the weeds and making it happen. So I moved to the employer side for the last 10 years. You know, I was thinking about, as Maeve was talking about the different sizes, you know, I worked at an employer with a few hundred, then one employer with a few thousand. Now I'm here at AT&T. But so really kind of thinking about, right, in my mind about like all those different experiences, because they are a little bit unique along the way. And then again, as Cindy mentioned, right, there's no single answer. Every employer has their own approach, their own culture, their own financial needs, right? So, and so when I think about, right, your question around access and affordability and trying to balance that, some of it is employers are already facing that today. You know, access, for example, is not just this binary choice, right? Do you make a complex therapy available? Sure, that's one consideration. But again, as Cindy mentioned, the providers, right, who perform those therapies, how do I ensure that my rural member has access to high quality oncologists to drive their correct diagnosis and treatment plan, if CAR T therapies are appropriate? But then how do I balance that with engaging, you know, those trusted community oncologists? So those aren't unique, right, to this one space. And so I think it's part of a broader discussion we need to be looking at, again, prioritizing quality. And again, I'll dive in a little bit further on, you know, the logistics for receiving the therapy, right? So it's more than just, hey, how's the drug covered? But it's, you know, do you have the right medical travel coverage? Do you have paid leave policies with caregiver support resources? Are you really being equitable, right, to all of your members with access? Right now, on probably most of our lips is the concept of social determinants of health and how do we improve, you know, DE&I in healthcare. And frankly, I think these therapies are really a great proving ground for whether organizations really want to do their part to tackle these broad systemic issues, but come to life in very specific situations.
Hey, Luke, you
yeah.
said you love to dive into the weeds, and we got an
All right.
in the weeds question from Victoria for you. All right.
Fantastic.
So you can pull it up if you want to read it on that
Yep.
Q&A, but I'll read it out loud for everyone here too. How do self-insured employer plans address the need to modify pre-certification lists and codes, especially with the challenge that newly approved gene and cell therapies don't usually have a specific HCP CP code established when it's first launched? So has that been a challenge for you as well, I presume? And what do you do?
That is usually when I would call someone because right, getting down into how is that going to be coded as covered. That's probably one step further down, right? I'd go to, you know, the administrator to figure that out.
So you would take the role as self-insured employer saying that you want this covered. And Michelle, I mean, this is the fun of a panel. Michelle,
Yep.
Come on in and give us all a hand here. You're on mute, Michelle.
Yeah, apparently I had a problem with that earlier too. So anyway, typically when these new therapies come out, the major carriers take an approach of not covering them at all and doing medical necessity reviews until they've had a chance, till the HCPCS codes have been established and J codes and all that stuff. And so that's the way in which they address them. But self-insured employers have to find out if that's their carrier's policy and how it's going to be addressed. Also, You want to look for the non-specific HCPCS codes that could be used that cross over, right? And see how they handle those. Are those pulled out manually? And then we look and see what the therapy is to see if that's addressed. And then the medical necessity review will take place. So I encourage, that's the way I would advise my members. Cindy, do you have, I mean, what are your thoughts?
I think it's right along those lines. And we'll look to what has been happened to shape what needs to happen. And that's probably a proactive stance that we may need to address. We could start working on that now to address, because there's probably regulatory requirements involved in that. And we know those that runway could be pretty long. But I think it's a great question and things for us to consider. I mean, we're dealing with that now with the new Alzheimer's drug that just came out. We're all going, is it B? Is it D? How do you bill it? So yeah, maybe we can be proactive and prevent some of those questions.
Hey, and Mabe, I'd like you to jump in on this too, because from a stop loss standpoint, as you pointed out in your talk, these are mostly going to flow into the stop loss. So it's not just whether it's at the administrator side, but it's also whether the stop loss is going to cover it, right? And how do you advise talking to your stop loss carrier?
So typically self-insured employers are buying administrative services from some type of regional health plan. And that regional health plan has developed these pre-authorizations or pre-certifications on their fully insured business. So it's very common for the self-insured employer to adopt what that carrier is doing on their fully insured business. That's typically the starting point.
Okay, so hopefully it goes smoothly, but it sounds like a good deal of the burden is on the self-insured employer to make sure this all connects. Is that right? Otherwise, the pieces won't all be there. And what's been your experience about how to do that proactively for these very expensive therapies, right? I mean, when it's something smaller, but this would seem to be a big deal, and you want to be out in front of it before your employee comes to you saying that they want access to it, because then it's a real fire drill, right?
Yeah, and so we haven't really seen many employers say that they're not going to cover these types of treatments. Without specifically stating this type of treatment within a plan policy, it's more than understood that if the plan is covering it, then the member can have access to that type of care. What we've seen in some complex situations is employers state how they would go about covering a certain condition that a member needs to go seek treatment from a qualified specialist of that treatment. We've seen like fraud and abuse with certain drugs that are covered under a plan where the prescriber is not an expert in that condition. And so we could likely see some stipulations where members need to seek care, like in a center of excellence, for example. Now, with the gene therapies that are in the market right now, they're not just readily available to anybody. You need to have these certain conditions, and for Luxturna, for example, there's only a handful of centers of excellence in the country that can administer that treatment. So these treatments are going to be hard on the fraud and abuse side relative to what we've seen with some other drugs.
Oh, okay. Hey, Michelle, following up with you, I talked about the pipeline coming in, right? And that there's a handful today, but we expect that to grow to like 19 approvals in the next 2-3 years. So what do self-insured employers need to do now? And what do they, need to be doing to prepare for this, wave of products that we think is going to really start picking up in the next year or two?
Yeah, so I kind of answered this a little bit with Jane's question earlier, but I think there's really 4 main things that I think self-insured employers can do right now, and I'll expand on them as I can. One is assessing the current state. The second is leveraging your consultants and your brokers. The third is kind of the stop loss evaluation and your stop loss carrier. And then Finally, the fourth is around establishing some criteria that is going to force your decision. So assessing your current state, understand how likely your population is to be utilizing some of these treatments that are coming down the pipeline. Are they, like Mabe said, known kind of instance, known risk or unknown risk? The toolkit at MIT will help you to do that. So I encourage you to do that. As you're assessing, make record of your current stop loss if you have it, the attachment points, deductibles, and all of that, and see if you need to actually have a carve out solution. For some people, like Mabe said, it may be that your stop loss is what you want. And then you have to think about, as you're looking at the pipeline, what are the conditions as you're assessing your population? Do I have 4 or 5 hemophiliacs in my population? And that's coming, and that's going to be huge. And what is the offset? And what, do they frequently turn over, or are they because they have this known condition and they've got coverage, they're going to stay with me forever, and I need to kind of make sure I'm going to have something aware for them. And then, so then it's assessing, talking to your consultant, and your consultant may be able to help you with that assessment and see what they advise, what they have in their, kind of in their marketplace to be able to bring solutions, and what they think may be helpful, and ensure that they're kind of watching the pipeline for you as well, so that you understand what the impact is going to be. They know your population, they know the pipeline. They may be able to get in front of you and say, okay, the time is now. We got to do something. If you're going to entertain one of these alternative products, and even if you're not, you need to meet with your stop loss carrier or whoever is providing your stop loss benefit, because you may have a premium increase or decrease depending on what you decide to do, right? Or there may be people lasered out. Or if you have one of these reinsurance and carve outs, can you negotiate a better premium or a higher attachment point or deductible on your regular stop loss and be able to offset some of that premium? And then kind of really understand what's the criteria that's going to make you make the decision and outline it, so that as you're monitoring, when you hit that criteria, okay, if I have this, and this happens, this means we've got to go right now, or I've got to purchase some type of product, or I have to change my stop loss, or my budget or something. So having that plan in advance, so you're not always trying to chase and figure it out. You kind of know what's coming, what happens that makes me change my mind from the current course, and then being able to then follow that course as that criteria exists.
Hey, Cindy. Oh, go ahead, Luke. Yeah, jump in.
I was just going to jump on a comment you made there that I absolutely love. If you're a consultant broker on the call right now, right, your clients that are 500 to 5,000, right, they aren't able to think about this. You need to be the ones thinking for them, because maybe your stop loss carrier probably changes from year to year. And so there is that consideration of a little bit more long term, getting smart, getting ahead of it, because your customer certainly isn't. How do you, be a good advisor on the front end? Sorry, just wanted to point that out.
And Cindy, I presume that you agree with that sort of view, that this is really a partnership and a place where the consultants add a huge amount of value to that middle market?
I absolutely agree. So use the consultant community as your eyes and your ears and your experts.
Now, I know we have a number of the consultants actually dialed in here today. How do you deal with the employers, your clients, who are less interested in getting ahead of it, right? That it's in their best interest, but they're not really quite so open to having that. They just want a good tactical plan for the next year. I mean, do you push this, or do you just sort of let the customer rule, or do you have some tricks to help open their eyes and help them take a bigger view?
So, it is about an obligation to share the information. and to make the case for why this is vitally important to their successful future and their philosophy and their culture of what they want to achieve, and possibly in that size market, their viability to keep their doors open. So to make the case, not be an alarmist, but to be an informant. And and then at the end of the day, though, it is that client's decision as to how.
Yeah, and go,
Well,
Luke.
what might be helpful is if there happened to be a tool, a kit of some sort that would help you model and understand what that risk looked like. Again, shameless plug for the toolkit.
Toolkit. Yeah, thank you, Luke. Really appreciate it. So that's again paying for cures at MIT Toolkit. Put those keywords into Google and you'll get right there. So, and I know when I did some consulting formerly early in my career, and we made a big distinction between clients and customers, right? Customers are always right. Clients need your advice and your judgment going forward, right? And so Cindy's use of the word client, I think, is really apropos here. There's a certain obligation and role for everyone here to inform and advise and bring these things to people's attentions, even if they don't think that they want it yet. It's sort of a big deal. So Mabe, I'd like to come back to you on this now. We heard some hints about maybe you should take a longer view look with your stop loss carrier, right? That it's not a turn it over every year and put it out to bid, but some value to relationship over time with this. And you've talked about these lasering issues and other sorts of things. What's your thought? Is this role of the relationship with the stop loss carrier changing a bit from just being a financial transaction? Not that it ever really was just that, but you talked about needing to track the data, being able to be a better partner. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, at the risk of sounding completely biased on this, I think there's a lot of value to maintaining long-term relationships with any vendor you're doing business with, whether it's your broker and consultant, or whether it's your health plan administrator, or whether it's your stop loss carrier. I think long-term relationships help situations. What I tend to tell customers in stop loss is, stop loss is stop loss. These contracts are very similar, carrier to carrier. That's what makes the product somewhat commoditized, where you can go to another vendor who's willing to do it for 5% less. But at some point, somebody needs a favor, and stop loss carriers tend to make extra contractual payments for their longstanding customers and their longstanding broker and consultants. And so I think there's a lot of value to that. This marketplace has doubled since 2014. So it's a very big marketplace. It's garnering a lot of attention. It's getting more sophisticated. And so I think as the marketplace grows, I think the employers will take a longer viewpoint on the carriers that service this space as well. So I'm a big advocate for long-term relationships.
Yeah, so let me follow up on that. So you said, you didn't want to be so self-promoting about it. So let me turn it the other way.
Sure.
What do groups such as yours and all the stop loss people, who we have quite a number logged in here today, what do they need to do to earn that long-term relationship, right? So it's always something to ask for, but what do you do to earn it?
Yeah, I think what you do to earn it, for one, I think employers are looking for price stability. So it's not a lot of fun to get a reduction in rate today if it's going to mean a gigantic increase in rate tomorrow. And so starting with a fair price and then having reasonable, rate increases or rate holds if that's what the experience dictates. I think just being reasonable with how the premium changes year to year is a good starting point. Second, I think the stop loss carriers, they have an expertise in this space that they can bring to employers. And brokers and consultants don't always take advantage of that expertise. But if you're playing in the space where you only cover claims that exceed $100,000, then guess what? You're an expert on cancer, on organ transplants, on other issues that your broker and consultant may not be as in tune to, because they're really helping that employer with first dollar issues. And so from that perspective, there's an expertise there to take advantage of. And I think if stop loss carriers can bring that expertise to their employer clients, there's a lot of value to provide.
That's excellent. So I'm sure you're all seeing the role of questions coming in here. And Cindy, maybe you can take a quick take on Chris's question around what are the solutions you'd recommend for the mid-market in the context of, what's the heavy lift here for the employers or not, right? So it's one thing to say it's wonderful to be proactive, but there's only so many hours in the day. You got a small staff. How do you think about which of these solutions to go after or not? And of course, we're in the work that Michelle and others did, that's information that's out there. We're not advocating. We're not the Consumer Reports. So Chris, you're going to be disappointed. We're not going to do you should go to company X kind of thing here. But we can help you with some of those criteria and things to think through. So what do you think there, Cindy?
Yeah, so just kind of, I think, in no particular order, your stop loss discussion is obviously very important in the middle market. And how is that going to work? How does that fit? I think the other place to go is to really kind of hits one of the other questions of the whole clinical management and the quality and the care. You really may need to do something different than we have done in the past. And I would look at your experience in specialty pharmacy, some things you're doing there. It may not all fit. It probably, in fact, I know it doesn't all fit, but there are some things emerging there in the clinical management and point solutions coming out, because it is going to be vitally important that the patients that need the therapies get them. And as we talked about a little bit earlier, vitally important that you have a defensible solution for saying when it's not, because I always talk about I used to talk about we're entering the era of the 4 E's, but we're in the throes of the era of the 4 E's. And those 4 E's are, we've always historically looked at the clinical evidence and the economics to make coverage determinations. But we now have two other E's, in addition to the evidence and the economics. We have to consider the emotions and the ethics. So to get your arms around that, and again, your culture and your philosophy leads me to say that I would look at that clinical management and that provider engagement and involvement is probably the other spot. It's in addition to the financing mechanisms that go through the list and go through the toolkit tool to say which fit for you. But if I had to point some of it, it would be obviously the financing, but then that clinical and provider management would be also essential to look at.
That's great. And maybe we're going to jump down to Joe's question, and then we're going to come back to Lucas's question. So Lucas, we're going to get to you, but it seems timely. Joe, this has this pretty long question for you, Mabe, and I think you've been reading through it, but I'm going to see if I can set you up on this one, right? So this is, the FDA's approved it for, any kid under 2, but the clinical trial evidence, if you look at it, was really only for type 1 children under like 6 months or a year. And I know a number of groups have really gone by the clinical trial evidence, not just by the FDA approval evidence, to the extent that they can, dealing with the second 2 E's that Cindy was talking about, the emotion and the ethics of this. So do you see this kind of refinement of eligibility criteria and differences between what, say, the administrator, the company, and the stop loss insurer? That seemed to be something you emphasized in your talk, was making sure that was all aligned ahead of time and not after the fact, right?
Yeah, so I don't claim to be a clinician on this topic of spinal muscular atrophy, so I'm going to freestyle here for a second. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, the FDA says this treatment is good to the age of 2. and a patient situation emerges and the doctor says, hey, this patient is 2 years and 10 days old, and this treatment will work for this patient. Well, if the contract of the stop loss contract states that they're going to follow the guidelines of the FDA, that would state that that patient is not eligible for Zolgensma. Now, however, back to Cindy's comment about ethics, maybe between the employer who's allowed to pay for whatever claim they want to pay, they're self-insured. If they decide they want to pay that claim for a patient who's 2 years and 10 days old, it's their prerogative. It doesn't mean, though, that that claim would apply towards stop loss coverage. So there could be situations where an employer makes a decision on the type of claims that they're willing to pay because they have that employer to employee relationship and it's meaningful enough for them to do something that's different than what is stated in their policy. That doesn't mean, however, though, that the insurer or the stop loss reinsurer need to abide by that same decision.
Right, Luke, so do you see these tension like playing out in reality, or are we into sort of an academic world here where people like me love to talk about these possibilities, but it doesn't really happen very much? Or is this real?
I mean, I'll actually go back to Maeve's comment earlier of why you want a relationship with a stop loss carrier, because that would be one of those, right? It's outside the guidelines. Is there some extra contractual work you could do, perhaps, right? So, but yeah, I've been in that situation as the employer, kind of getting the pressure, not just like someone pushing down, but again, that ethical, what's the right thing to do. One of the things I think employers know this that are on the call is, right, benefits sits in human resources. It doesn't sit in finance, right? There is a certain amount of humanity that kind of almost by obligation, right, is imbued in this. So I think that is a fair point.
So Michelle, I'm going to toss it back to you for Lucas's question, which builds on this case study somewhat that we've just been working through is, well, this all sounds great, and as long as employers have infinitely deep pockets, they can always pay for all this, right? So they can go with the emotion and stuff and forget about that second E of economics, but they can't, right? And they have to work through this. So what do you see happening in this space, Michelle, where self-insured employers sort of try to get out in front of this, but still try to put in policies that they've really thought through with their third-party administrator, themselves, their employees, and have to deal with the economics of this, which means some tough calls sometimes. What are you seeing there? You're on mute still, Michelle.
So I think for my experience is going to be in the definitely in the middle market, right? And I think there's little tolerance for deviating against the PA criteria set by their plan administrator. They really rely and kind of use them so that they don't have to make a potentially preferential decision on coverage, right? You decided for this person you're going to cover it, but what happens when the next person comes along? And by assigning that decision making to the administrator, it takes them out of any type of biased or potential biased decision. Having said that, it doesn't mean that they can't work with their TPA to establish the criteria that then that administrator enforces, right? So say I don't like the PA criteria that you have, XYZ carrier. This is the criteria that I want for my company. This is what I want to do. If it meets the, FDA labeling and let's say take the example we just used, the child is 2 plus or minus 10 days or whatever, I'm going to say that that is approved, even though that's not what your standard is, and I want it changed for me. But then they assign the enforcement of it and the applicability of it to that administrator so that they're not caught having to make a decision on a employee by employee basis. Does that make sense?
It does, and you're going to see it in the opposite direction in hemophilia. just so everyone knows, because those trials are set at about 16 to 18 years old. It has to do with the fact that it goes into livers, and livers continue to grow in children, and so they're concerned about that the liver be adult sized before they get the therapy. But you can see the 15-and-a-half-year-old coming in, that it's a female who's hit all their growth spurts. They're 15 or 15 and a half, they're severe, and you're going to see people wanting to get access to the therapy, even though FDA said you had to be 16, right? So you're going to see it on both ends, I think, through this. Do you guys agree with that? And has that ever been a challenge in any other therapy area, that you're always playing these boundaries, or is it somewhat unique with these?
I mean, that general situation exists, right, all the time, where you see, I can't remember, I think Cindy was talking about some of the different approaches to like specialty management, and how are you thinking about specialty PA and approvals, and right, are those managed appropriately? Because there are some step therapies that don't make sense because you've got to wait several months to get to the right drug, when there may be other ways to get there through different care or different groups. The big difference here is, right, a little bit of the one and done, but with a huge price tag. That's a different flavor than Remicade, right, being approved or not approved for several months or that kind of thing. I think that's what makes this a little bit unique.
Indeed. Hey, Cindy, building on this, this sort of big one and done thing, do you think it's possible for employers to engage more directly with some of the precision financing solution contracting, or participating in some of the pilots, even perhaps directly with manufacturers or in conjunction with one of their insurance TPA sorts of partners, or is that just too heavy a lift?
So I think it gets back to the culture and the philosophy of the client and the employer. Some will, love to run into that space. It clearly is an easier space, barriers to entering that space of participating in some of these pilots. The larger you are, the easier the entrance is into those pilots of the financing mechanisms. But that doesn't mean that there's not an opportunity for mid-market employers to kind of group together, the kind of a GPO model for entering pilot financing, because it depends on the particular disease prevalence that the entity, the therapy would be involved with, because even in a jumbo, it might require some of that coming together. What's involved for the employer, it's a heavy data lift, and there's a lot of regulatory, again, implications, complications, considerations of HIPAA, anti-kickback, name the reg, but probably needs pretty heavy lift of the data use agreements, and working with your employees. How comfortable do you feel with pharma company having access into a lot of detailed data on your employees or their family members? So those are some of the considerations, but definitely possible. I think it comes back to the level of interest. The larger you are, the easier it is, but I think there will be opportunities for combination to really participate in those precision financing examples.
And I think what I took away perhaps from that, Cindy, is if you have a population which has a number of these potential cases in it, then you might feel very differently than if you don't, right? So if you have 2, 3, 4, 5 hemophilia, just to pick on that particular indication again, or you're in the sickle, you have a heavily African-American population. So, you have a sickle cell prevalence within your population, and there's sickle cell gene therapies coming down. You might be more motivated, or it might be worth the business time to really dive into that. Am I thinking about that correctly?
I think so. And one other consideration in this is, as we kind of flip our hats around, put a different hat on from the pharmaceutical manufacturer, the developer perspective, the more tightly or more aggressively an employer may want to manage the particular disease and the clinical criteria and the provider community, and what kind of parameters are you going to put on the follow-up for the prescriber that ensures you get the outcome. The more tightly or aggressive that an employer wants to manage that, probably the more interest you generate in having the conversation with the developer to pursue that.
Great. So, Luke, did you want to say something? I didn't say. All right. So, Michelle, going back to your presentation, we sort of now talked about might the middle market participate in these, but these new market solutions are really often targeted at these sorts of things. So do they play into this? And particularly if I'm planning as a self-insured employer, how do I think about planning whether I even need to worry about these market solutions and how to best take advantage of them?
Yeah, so I think understanding the market solutions that are out there, and I don't want to, again, I don't want to recommend one or the other, but it's getting as much information as you can and understanding the key questions based on that assessment I talked about earlier, right? Where you are, what your prevalence looks like, what your stop loss looks like, what your consultants brought to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of figure out which of those solutions fit kind of your footprint. And then there has to be a layer of what I want, right? Do I want a performance-based solution where I only want to pay for something if it works? And I'm not worried about patient mobility or any of those other things. I'm small, so I'm not going to contract directly. So there is a solution that gives me access to a performance-based contract, handles the data management, and that's what I want. Or am I the type of person where, no, my budget has to be this. I'm all about known fiscal spending, and I have to know. I can't worry about the unknown. I want to know what's going to be this year or this quarter or whatever. Then the solutions I'm going to turn to are going to be those that offer that level of security
Mm-hmm.
from a cash flow perspective that match my assessment and my criteria. So I think it's a little bit of homework that needs to happen. And I feel like the consultants on the phone are really the ones that are gonna, it's roll up your sleeves time, right? And digging into that and be your partner through this, because they're gonna have to come with some kind of recommendations for you. You can't be expected on your day-to-day job of managing employee benefits to also figure out what the best solution is. That's why you have folks to do that for you.
So Luke, I see you nodding your head up and down a lot. Michelle just talked like a company is like a single decision maker, but that's rarely the case, right? The CFO may value one thing and the health benefits another, and the union rep something else, right, through all this. So what's that internal process like? I mean, we've talked like companies are single decision-making groups, right? But is that really the case? And how much do the consultants have to know about that whole internal process, or can they stay away from all that complexity?
Yeah. I mean, this is turning into the consultants have a whole lot on their plate conversation, but yeah, I think it is, right? And again, that's somewhat not unique to this space, right? In that, consultants need to understand, especially at this size, right? Where they need to understand what the different dynamics and considerations within the company. How can I, who's their customer? Because sometimes their customers on the finance side and their clients on the HR side, if I go back to your terminology, right? So there's a little bit of that. How do I solve for the different complexities? That's what makes consulting fun and exciting, but also a little unnerving. I would say, again, it goes back to there's a balance that you can build here. And one of the things that, as we were just talking about COEs and value-based, design and, hyper personalization of healthcare about one individual. I keep going. These are all things that we are talking about more broadly in healthcare, and that we are starting to think about. But this is kind of a great example to say, here's kind of your touch point of where and when do you value those things? Because if I'm a consultant, start here, because then you can say, all right, you know what, they're not really interested in going to, a radical value-based payment model, or right, changing
Mhm.
these things. It might be a good place to start because it's new, but then be able to learn from it to move to more broadly.
Great. So Cindy, as we're talking about the consultants and how much is on their plates, and you sort of heaped some more on them today through all that, how does a self-insured employer know, that the benefits consultant is doing a good job at this stuff, right? How do you separate those who are fantastic from those who are merely good?
So I'll give you a scorecard to
A
use.
scorecard. Well, that's practical and actionable. We like that on this panel.
So, first and foremost, I think, Luke, kind of bouncing off of something you said, your consultant has to understand that you as an employer are in the business of healthcare. You really are, whether you want to be or not, but you are. And then it's not just healthcare. It is the resilience and the productivity, but it's also the things, Luke, you talked about, the social determinants and the diversity, equity, and inclusion. So first and foremost, your consultant has to understand those those parameters. It's not, again, one thing. So, but the scorecard of what I would come in to grade your consultant on is, number one, the strategy development. And do they have the talent that is across multiple pieces of healthcare and social determinants and workforce productivity and wellness? You have to throw that in there too, I think, Luke. You would probably think so. But it's not like you've got one person in the consulting firm that's going to know those things. You need the financial acumen, you need the Mabes of the world around that table. So it really takes a consultant village to develop that strategy. So I would look at, how does the strategy match my culture and my desires, and have they listened to what is important to me? They might tell me some things that I've said not important, but that balance of once we decide what's important. So the strategy development. Equally important, I think, to use your consultant and to grade them on how have they helped me execute the strategy. Because how many people have a beautiful strategic plan that sits in their desk and you blow the dust off of it? So the stakes are too high in cell and gene therapies to have a beautiful strategic plan that is not executed upon. So that's another component.
So they have to be aware of all these tactics, like we heard before in some of the first questions, right? How do you deal with the coding? How do you deal with the network creation? What do you do if they have to travel to a center of excellence? They really have to know those details, not just, we'll do some performance contract, or we'll, make sure the stop loss is aligned with the benefit design or the plan that we're dealing with. You want a little more depth out of them, it sounds like.
It has to. This is complicated stuff, and you need those experts that have the talent that know that. Another expertise you're looking for is understanding pharmaceutical manufacturer contracting and the data requirements that go into that. That is another whole just specialized area that's you need that expertise. But so the development of the strategy, the execution of the strategy, that includes, how well have they helped you manage your vendor, that vendor oversight? How Do they help you? How good at they are giving you actionable insights from the analytics, whether the consultant's doing the analytics, whether the employer's doing the analytics, whether your TPA is doing the analytics, or the farmer's doing, whoever's doing it, how do they bring that all together to make it useful and meaningful to you as the employer? And I would also say just that measuring and that monitoring is absolutely vital. And some employers will use their consultants to do that, others may not. But if you select that service, make sure you are on top of that, and that you have the information to be informed of what's going. And I'll sum it up with this. And Luke, I listened to you because another excellent consultant trait is that you listen to the clients and their needs. But I was going to say, when you get the phone call from the CFO and you have to go to his or her office to explain what the heck this financials was from last month because you had one of these, but it's actually, I would say, to the CFO and the human resources or the CEO or anybody's office that you as the employer person charged with the cell and gene therapy would like to go. Has your consultant given you the information and the knowledge that in 5 minutes you feel you are prepared to go have the conversation with whomever in your organization you need to have that, and that you can have the conversation that's meaningful to them and talk to them in their language? That would
Excellent.
be success.
That would be success. And Michelle, I saw you leaning into this one, literally. You're really leaning into the camera. Do you want to build on this? You're on mute, by the way, so make sure you're off mute.
Not necessarily build on it, but that's so important. It's to be able to help those in the benefits department to be able to tell their leadership in the language that they understand, what's important for them to hear. And it really is an art for a consultant to be able to provide that language to someone in that way.
Excellent. So
Can I
I'm
add
going
to
to,
this?
please, Mabe, absolutely.
So I think everything Cindy said is right on point. What I will add, though, is the bulk of employers in the country are 300 to 500 life employers that are in the widget making business, and they have one person in HR. They don't have these gigantic teams of thought leaders. They're not the AT&Ts and the Boeings and the Crafts, who are just mega employers who have a staff of people who talk to people like Cindy and Michelle all day long, right? And so the reality is, in that segment, it's very transactional. And where it's transactional, it's very dangerous, because those employers don't necessarily spend the right adequate time on these really key financial decisions. And so I just wanted to point that out, because most of the employers in the country are not the mega employers that are just have a deep talent on their teams to solve these problems.
Yeah, and by the time we get this product flow coming in 2025, and perhaps a year or two after that, even companies of that size are likely to see a case of some kind of this in a 5 or 8 year period, right? So they're not going to have one every year,
Right.
but in your career as the HR person there, you're going to have one of these pop up, right? And that's a career making moment, it would seem to me.
I think one of the most challenging, sorry, Luke.
No, please, Michelle.
I think one of the most challenging sizes of the employers, to Maeve's point, are the ones with the 400 to 500 lives, because under 400, they're probably fully insured, right? And so they're just riding along, and the carriers got them covered, right? They've got that big risk pool, they're not so worried. But above 400, closer to 500, that's when they start to get in the self-insurance space, where they are running the health plan, right? So they're the plan. And to Maeve's point, they don't have the teams like the 5,000, 6,000 employee companies have.
And having been one of those employers running benefits for 800 employees. And right, again, as we said, right, you don't have time to get and think about, long-term 5 years. You're thinking about open enrollment is coming up and, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? I think that's why, again, it's so critical that you've got consultants. I remember a time I was sitting there and I got a call from accounting and they said, hang on, there's just a claims process from the TPA for, several 100,000 or whatever. What's going on? And I went, I have no idea. Now, if you imagine, right, that number becomes 1.2 million or whatever, right? And then you go, I have no idea. Your next call is your broker and you're saying, what's going on? That's the unique thing about this is this is pretty short window here. You're not going to have that, like, again, like a Remicade where it's monthly or bi-monthly, whatever. This is going to sneak up and you've got to have a plan ahead of time, even if your client's not thinking about it.
And Luke, to build on that, what do you expect out of your health plan itself, the carrier, the administrator, right? I mean, seems to me if they're going to send that kind of claim through, it'd be nice if they like dropped you a line saying, oh, by the way, there's $500,000 or $1 million charge coming your way.
Yeah, exactly. And to dig into it further, that's why I think a lot of the conversation we've had today is like, get smart before a claim shows up. Because trying to figure out buy and bill, right, where the physician can buy the drug and just pass along whatever cost plus markup, that's easier to manage when it's, maintained, but not a maintenance drug like this situation. So it's understanding, right, how are they going to process this? What financial arrangements do they have? I mean, I could.
Yeah, and just if I could build on that, sorry to interrupt you, but these hemophilia products, the way, at least a number of them are, they're these viral vectors. It's basically, you're going to hang a bag once, right? It looks like a clear IV bag, right? And they're going to infuse once, and it's a $4 million therapy, which the hospitals can put in some of their contracts, I understand it. It's a new technology that therefore has 100% markup on it. And so a $4 million event turned into an $8 million event for a one-day job for the hospital, right?
Yep.
I've heard people, now the products haven't been approved, this sort of stuff hasn't really happened, but I've heard this sort of horror story being talked about. Is that really something you need to talk to your administrators with, or do the good ones really have all this covered and they make sure you're not going to get an $8 million charge for a hemophilia bag?
I don't trust any of them. No, I mean, I wouldn't trust them to be looking out for that, right? They're not the fiduciary on this, right? I am, right? That's my role, is to be, right, minding my P's and Q's. That's not really their role. They're just there to kind of push numbers from one place to the other, to be totally frank about it, right? So,
okay. But then can I just be lackadaisical and say, well, that's why I bought a product from MAPE. So, I don't care if it's 4 million or 8 million, as long as it's over $100,000, it's free to me. Right?
Unless he's lasered them because they're a known risk, right? They're a hemophiliac, so he already lasered them out. And we said, that's fine. We know how much their hemophilia treatment costs. Well, now you don't, right? Because it could shoot up. Anyway,
And I think that's the mindset that has to be different, and embraced. Of there are numerous proactive things that have to happen, like talking now in provider contracts. It's like when we get into these therapies, it's not a buy, sell, spread profit margin for the institution. We will focus our payments on the services and the administration and the follow-up care to deliver the durability of the product. But those are the discussions that have to take place.
Yeah, and just again, I'm sorry, but in the blood disorders, that's a marketplace built on markups and 340B, right? And so, and it's a lifeline to those groups, right? So there may be pushback in some of these indications, from sickle cell to hemophilia to Wildebrands disease. A number of these are really in this buy and bill, sort of in even 340B area, which is a big deal. And we have this question from Chris, who wants to play lawyer for a moment? So if the bag breaks or there's other sorts of liability that something goes wrong, these cell therapies don't always work. They have huge challenges with some of the cell therapies. Who pays for all that? So Mabe looks like he's going to take that one. I see it's typing an answer there, Mabe. So
I stopped typing. I didn't want to play lawyer, but since you asked, I'll try to answer.
okay.
I mean, I would think that, so first of all, a self-insured employer is they're not liable if a person is going for some type of treatment and the treatment doesn't go the right way. Self-insured employer is there to reimburse the claims of their members. In terms of something going bad during the course of a treatment, there's various liabilities there. Providers purchase all types of liability coverage, like malpractice, for example, and I would think that that's a liability that they assume.
Got it. So we're down to the last 8 minutes. So everybody gets 2 minutes for the most important thing. We've heard everything from 4 E's to Michelle's sort of process about how one should go through. Mabe's had some key points. Luke, you've been there. So you got 1.5 minutes apiece. What do you want people to walk away with? Who wants to start? Mabe, your microphone's off, so you get to go first if you want.
Okay, so I would just say that this is I think Cindy mentioned that the decisions on covering these types of treatments are, moving into the ethical range, and that's certainly the case. But I'm going to put that to the side for a second and just focus on the financial implications of these treatments. And as more and more treatments come to market that are super expensive, the frequency of these claims will go up, and it becomes a place where employers, Michelle said this, they are in, actually I think maybe Cindy said this, they are in the healthcare business. When you're a self-insured employer, this is one of the businesses you're in. You're in the widget making business and you're in healthcare. And so it's very important that self-insured employers are learning about this space, that they're working with their consultants and brokers to really dive in to understand all the solutions that are out there. Michelle did a really good job of lining out all the available market solutions today. I'm sure there will be many more that come to market over the course of the next few years. And this will become a very important insurance decision, just like other liability insurances are becoming extremely important. A lot of times when we talk about these types of claims in our space, we compare it to cyber claims, right? If you look at what's happening in the cyberspace, there is so many new claims coming into this space that nobody even thought to consider before, and that's really similar to what's happening with cell and gene therapy.
All right.
And so it's going to become a prevalent space where the risk managers, where the CFOs, along with their HR partners, are going to be making joint decisions.
Great. So we're going to go to Michelle and then Cindy, and Luke, as the self-insured employer on the panel officially, you get the final word. So Michelle, what's your 90 seconds of final takeaways?
So I think the final takeaways for me, if I was an attendee here, is that right this minute, probably current situation with stop loss is adequate, but I need to start planning now for the future. And it's time to start doing that. It's time to create a plan, learn, and figure out when and what is going to make me change the current course.
Got it. Cindy.
So I'm going to go right along the same line, that I think that it really is important to invest the time in preparing so that as the self-insured employer, you maximize your financial investment, but also maximize the care and the health and the well-being of your workforce and the caregivers and their dependents. So be prepared.
Great point. Luke, final word.
And I'll pull on that last thread and kind of hammer it more, which is how do we ensure equitable access, right? If we have COEs on the different coasts and you've got a rural population in Arkansas, how in the world are you going to make sure that these treatments, not just the price of the drug, but the access, the ability to get out there, get the care they need, ongoing support, right? There's a lot more that needs to be part of it, truly, if you're going to get value out of this. And frankly, you want to make sure your employees are cared for and their families. So yeah, we just took that whole spectrum from financial to caring about the person.
There we go. I think we had all 4 of Cindy's E's there all the way through. So that's excellent. Thank you to all 4 of you and to everyone who's been listening. That's great. We have a couple polling questions and a couple more things that Jane's going to finish up. So don't go away. We've got another couple exciting things here. Jane, over to you.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks again to the panel members. Really, really great wrap up for the day. So I am going to just wrap this up in just a few minutes. I hopefully will let you out a couple minutes early, but let's bring up the last polling question. And this is one you saw earlier. We'd like you to take another look at it. And the question is, how likely are you to change your 2022 health benefits based on current or anticipated cell and gene therapies? All right, I think we can end the poll. I really have a mix of answers across the board, from definitely not to extremely likely. So I think folks have really taken to heart what has been presented today and are reflecting on how that's going to affect 2022.